So this is my keynote lecture on the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, and we consider the 30 Years' War in our Unit 2 topic of the Wars of Religion. Okay, so first off, let's start. It's not 30 years of continuous fighting. So let's clear the air on that. The 30 Years' War was a series of intermittent battles. Okay, they began over religious reasons, yes, but by the end, by 1648, we're clearly dealing with a political war with kind of elements of religious conflict, but certainly not certainly not a religious war of Protestants fighting Catholics over belief. Okay, the soldiers who fought in the 30 Years' War were not professional soldiers. They were mercenaries, or they were conscripted soldiers. Conscription is like our word drafting today. Soldiers who were drafted into service. So the men who fought the 30 Years' War were often farmers, men coming from ordinary walks of life, blacksmiths, workers in local villages, and so forth. The fighting was not marked by major battles at specific locations. In other words, it's not like not like the battles that we see in the Hundred Years' War or the War of the Roses or even the Napoleonic Wars of the 19th century. These battles were fought kind of like skirmishes, and it was sporadic and scattered. So a battle might break out in one area and then end and then pick up again in another area miles away. Most of the fighting of the 30 Years' War was concentrated in the Holy Roman Empire. In other words, the what we call the German Confederation. Please remember that in the 17th century, there was no nation called Germany. Instead, you had what they called a loose confederation. And by loose, I mean that they all happened to speak the German language, they all had German culture and German customs, but they were all independent regions. Okay, let's start the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was broken down into 4 phases by historians long ago. And so we're going to look at each of the 4 phases right now. Okay? The first phase is called the Bohemian phase. Now remember that Bohemia was a region in northeastern Europe, which today we associate with the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Now, we still use the word Bohemian. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to Bohemian culture. And a Bohemian person is often described today as someone who kind of operates by his or her own drummer. Somebody who is different, somebody who's kind of a free spirit. And so the word bohemian today often refers to artists. For instance, if you go to any of the big cities like New York or Chicago or San Francisco, even Los Angeles, they will have a bohemian neighborhood. So for instance, in Los Angeles, Venice and Santa Monica are often considered bohemian, meaning that the people who live there are kind of like an independent spirit. Very much their own people, not necessarily following the crowd. Okay, so when we say the Bohemian phase, we're referring to the first part of the 30 Years' War. Now, what happened was this. Ferdinand II was heir to the Holy Roman Empire. Now, remember that the Holy Roman Empire was an elected office. In other words, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was chosen by 7 electors of the German states. Okay, Ferdinand II was Catholic, and he wanted to impose a strict Catholicism on the Bohemians, who had kind of formed their own Protestant faith life. And so Protestantism was quite strong in Bohemia. Even though traditionally it had always been Catholic, Protestantism took hold in Bohemia. But remember that Protestantism in the 17th century was often tied to strong nationalist movements. And we saw that before, right? Okay. So in Prague, what happens is this. Ferdinand II, he sends some agents, some representatives, basically, to the city of Prague in order to kind of end this Protestant spread and bring the people of Prague back to Catholicism. Well, the agents show up and they basically gather at the town hall in Prague, the capital, demanding the end of this Protestant problem. And the agents are basically thrown out the window. They call it the defenestration of Prague. And when you defenestrate someone, you basically throw them out the window. To defenestrate means to throw out the window. So the agents of the emperor were thrown out the window. None of them died. They actually landed in some of the filth and rubbish on the street. But the message was clear. The people of Prague basically rose up in defiance of the emperor, Ferdinand II, who then launched what he saw as a religious war against Protestantism in Bohemia. We next see, a few years later, the Danish phase. What happens is what began as a religious war turns into now the involvement of Denmark. Now, Denmark was traditionally Protestant, okay? And so King Christian IV of Denmark, he felt that by coming to the aid of Protestants in Saxony, which is a region, I should say, of northern Germany, that he would be protecting Protestant interests. However, Christian IV also had his sights on extending the realm of Denmark. And so I'm sure he had hoped to gain some of the lands of northern Germany. The next phase of the 30 Years' War we call the Swedish phase. And this, of course, involves the country of Sweden under King Gustavus Adolphus. Now, Gustavus Adolphus was a brilliant man. He was a military genius, but he was also a very sensible man in the sense that he, like others that we've seen in the course, realized that the well-being of the country takes precedence over religious belief. And so Gustavus Adolphus, although he was a Protestant, he also realized that commerce and trade and business were important to Sweden, and that anything that would further these items, anything that would further these areas would benefit all the people of Sweden. So Gustavus Adolphus, he became kind of the figurehead, the leading Protestant of all the Protestant princes of Germany in their fight against the Holy Roman Empire. Now, Gustavus Adolphus also had political reasons in that he hoped to expand the Swedish dominance of what we call the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is located northeast of Europe, what we call the Baltic states. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania form what they call the Baltic states because they all border the Baltic Sea. You might want to just take a look at your map and you'll see the Baltic Sea over in the northeast portion of Europe. Now, Adolphus brought military innovation into the 30 Years' War. One of his, probably one of his greatest ideas was to replace heavy artillery with what they called light artillery. So instead of using the heavy cannons, which required a lot of men to move, he went with what they called light artillery. Okay? Our final phase of the 30 Years' War is what they call the Swedish-French phase. And this is an alliance, basically, of the Swedish Protestants with the French Catholics. Now, I'm going to say that again because earlier in this presentation I said that the 30 Years' War, it began as a religious conflict, but by the end had become quite political. And so let's look at this again. The final phase of the 30 Years' War was called the Swedish-French phase. And what this means is that France, under Cardinal Richelieu, now cardinals, remember, were a position of hierarchy in the Catholic Church. And in the early 17th century, Cardinal Richelieu was essentially the dominant power in France, Catholic France, mind you. Cardinal Richelieu allies with Swedish Protestants. So think about that for a moment. It can't, if the 30 Years' War was completely a religious war, why then do you have Protestants and Catholics fighting together? Why do you have Protestants and Catholics siding up, allying with each other to fight against a Catholic power like the Holy Roman Empire? So you think about that. That's the key. That's the key to understanding the 30 Years' War. Okay. The 30 Years' War ends with, in 1648 with what they call the Peace of Westphalia. Westphalia is a region in Germany. And the Peace of Westphalia, which we'll look at closely in class, but the peace essentially did the following. It reinforced the terms of the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. Okay? And by that, what I mean is it legalized Protestantism. But if you recall, the Peace of Augsburg of 1555, it only gave legal status to Lutherans. By 1648, the Peace of Augsburg extends that legal protection to the Protestant churches in general. Okay? What are the outcomes of the 30 Years' War? Well, number one, we have a weakening of the Habsburg power. Because remember, we've seen that name Habsburg before. Charles V, one of the most powerful men in Europe back in Luther's day, was a Habsburg. Philip II, his son, was a Habsburg. And Ferdinand II was a Habsburg. And so the weakening of the Habsburg power is what France wanted. Because, watch this, with the Habsburg power weakened, France comes to dominate the balance of power in Europe. And from this point on, we will see many of the European nations trying to break France's hold of the balance of power. And finally, Cardinal Richelieu, in the early 17th century, comes to dominate French politics. And he sets up the future power of Louis XIV of France.